Good morning to everyone. So for the past 30, 40 years, we've had some crises, some problems in society. 30 years, 40 years ago, a lot of people would have said drugs. Then 2001 came and people started talking about terrorism. Now, for the past 5 years, maybe 10, we've been flooded about disinformation and how this is becoming a problem. So, war on drugs, war on terror, and now war on disinformation. We've poured a lot of money into the fight against disinformation. Have we made several advancements? Have we improved? A lot of doubts on that. And my personal background in national security and working, for example, with terrorism taught me at least something that may look like it's simple or understandable, but that we are missing in the way that we see this information. And I can already give you a hint on where we are already starting badly. It is not a war. Against a drug problem, it was not a war. Against terror, it was not a war. Now, I used to work in intelligence, and in 2014, when the Islamic State was managing to convince young men and women from all over Europe to leave their quite comfortable lives in European cities and, go to Mosul without sometimes water, electricity. And law enforcement and intelligence services were concerned, how can we stop these people from going? And you would talk with them, and these people would be people like me and like you. They would have no criminal background. They would have no proponents to violence. They would be just young men and women who really believed they were going to be part of something greater, of something better. They really believed in what they were doing. On the other side, there was some people who were convincing them to join that you could see very clearly that they were hypocritical. They would have accounts in Swiss banks. They would send their kids into boarding schools in the UK. They would go in Paris and buy in the best shops. But our strategy against these fighters was based on treating them as criminals. We would hostilize very often the communities where they came from. We would try to arrest them. We would have a very punitive and bellic and warfare kind of tone into it. Did it work? Now, this is a kind of boring slide, so bear with me here, but it will all make sense. Right now, the European Union says that disinformation is false or misleading content that is spread with an intention to deceive. There is an intent to mislead the general public, the good ones, And that kind of separates disinformation from misinformation, which is false or misleading content shared without a harmful intent. So, it's based on error, lack of information. Most of us, I would say, share misinformation. We did not know that it wasn't accurate. It was a mistake. But I've been working with disinformation for a couple of years now. And it became clear that this division between disinformation and misinformation was missing a gap. Because when you think about vaccines, for example, we will have digital activists who really believe that vaccines are dangerous and are harmful. They will not vaccinate their kids. They will not vaccinate themselves. They think that if they do, they will come in harm's way. They believe in that. And they're very different from a very smaller group of people who have economic and power intent to share this and to promote anti-vaccine content. Because those people will vaccinate their kids and they will get themselves vaccinated as well, but they will sell you alternative medicines or things that will cure your cancer. So there's a big distinction. Also, when we think about anti-immigrants, there's the same. There's those people who really believe that immigrants commit more crimes. They're afraid of immigrants. They will cross the street. But there are others, a smaller group that's very strategic, that will have a Filipino nanny or a Latino gardener. So when we look at global warming, we have the same thing. Some people really believe it's a hoax. They truly believe in it. They will not be concerned about it. But some of the people who are driving this, they will not buy lands in the Maldives, despite saying that it's a hoax. So this distinguishing between misinformation and disinformation, between people who, make a mistake and those who want to deceive, doesn't really encapsulate the real problem. Why? Because there's a very big group in the middle. There's a very big group that really believes in what they are sharing. They are convinced, just like my young men and women who wanted to go to Syria, join the Islamic State, that they are part of something greater, that they know the truth nobody else does. And this is what I call organic disinformation. And it's very different from intentional disinformation that is made by threat actors and the hypocrites and the strategists who will vaccinate themselves, buy lands in the Maldives, and that will have foreigners in their workforce, for example. Now, why is this a problem? The problem is we've been working mostly on a dual perspective. So we are not creating solutions for the middle group. And this is even more true when we look, for example, on the progression between organic disinformation to intentional disinformation. Because when we look at the dozen who mostly shared disinformation on vaccines, so there was a study made that 12 people were responsible for most of the content on anti-vaccines. You will find out that a lot of people start as organic disinformers. They will start actually believing in it, but they will create a business or they will become leaders of a group. And at a certain moment, there's a shift, just like with terrorism. They're no longer really believing in that. They actually have an intentional and something to gain. Now, for the past 10 years, most of the investment that has been done by institutions, governments, has been on digital literacy and fact-checking. Is this not important? No, it is. It is super important because it really tackles misinformation. It really keeps people informed. It pre-bugs people against false narratives. And for the past 3-4 years, a lot of institutions have also realized that we have threat actors, really hostile organizations, countries, structures, in which we need to have a criminal perspective. We need to follow the money trail. So there's all these acronyms here: influence operations, foreign information, interference, tactics, techniques, and procedures, coordinated inauthentic behavior. So this is a very rational, kind of pragmatic response, forensic response to disinformation. It looks on how certain countries, for example, try to manipulate elections. But this will not solve the problem completely. Why? Because we still have this middle group. And this middle group is quite big. It's the ones who are making most of the noise, these digital activists. Now, going back to Mosul, what happened in 2014, particularly in Europe, was that countries realized that having law enforcement and having intelligence services going after the problem wasn't solving it. We needed a whole of society approach. We needed to understand that these young men and women would not be stopped by prison sentences, fines, police going into their houses, raiding their computers. No, it was much deeper than that. We needed social security, education, schools, community leaders, even religious figures that had a very positive approach on the problem. And we learned lessons from that, just like we learned from the war on drugs, in which Portugal is a remarkable example on a non-criminal attitude towards drugs. And it's funny how we haven't adopted it and used it to tackle disinformation. Now, what are the lessons we learned from ISIS? We need to push engagement over isolation. I keep saying this in every podcast I get invited. We need to build bridges with these people. We need to ask them, why do you feel this? Why do you feel vaccines are hurtful? Why do you feel immigrants will hurt you? Why? Explain it to me. Don't build walls, build bridges. Instead of focusing so much on digital literacy, let's focus on tolerance literacy. Let's not have this attitude of, I've studied, I know what science says, you are wrong. Because that will not bring these people closer to us, but it will bring them closer to those who do intentional disinformation, the real threat actors. We need to create a sense of purpose and identity for these groups that isn't connected to a false or misleading narrative. And this goes for politicians. We need to stop making excuses and saying we are losing elections only because of disinformation, because there are underlying motivations, injustice, inequality. And we need to recognize that these people are prone to believe in some false and misleading narratives because of deeper issues in the social tissue that politicians need to address. Instead of just saying, it's false, it's misleading information that people are being fed. Why do they believe that? Why do people feel that immigrants commit more crime? And finally, of course, we also need to rethink our narratives. Instead of building counter narratives and saying, this is the truth, this is actually what's going on, this is what science is, we need to build new narratives, resonating narratives that will account for the other two and reach out to people. So as a final conclusion, and looking to what we've learned on the war on drugs and the war on terror, we need to understand that we do not win from having a bellic approach on societal problems. We need to understand that these problems can only be tackled by looking at deep human stories behind them. We need to consider the human element. Thank you.